morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I promise I'll use the mic. It's great to be here. I want to, first of all, say thank you to St. Paul's Bellingham, Jonathan, Lindsay, Jim, everybody else that's made this possible. You've hosted us so many times in this place, and I have to say, it does feel like home when I'm here. It didn't the first few times I was here, I have to say. And some of you lived through those times, and you remember them well. But that's changed over time, and I really appreciate you. And I want to thank you all for being here, taking the time to be here today as we discern as a diocese. I want to thank RN for leading us, the chair of the standing committee. You're chair of your standing committee for this diocese, and she's giving a lot of her time to do basically what's going to now be 5 of these across the diocese, not just 4. We're adding a 5th one due to popular demand in St. John's Olympia on May 4th. So we'll do yet a 5th one as well. And then some of our staff is here, Josh Hornbeck and Greg Hester. They're filming. So they're not with CNN or Fox News or anything like that. They work for us, and we are actually filming this for our live album that we're going to go. No, I'm just kidding. We're filming it so that they can put this out so that people that could not make it to any of these will have some way to actually view what we're saying, what we're talking about, what we're doing. And then, as I'll say in a minute, we're going to have some opportunities for people to engage this in other ways, including you, through surveys that will go out to everyone in the diocese. So, because at the end of this time, probably, if we look at the numbers that we're seeing at these, we'll probably have 600 or 700 people maybe that have actually been able to be in this room. When in fact we have maybe 25,000 Episcopalians in Western Washington. So that's a very small percentage. So we want to give them another way to also engage. So thank you all for being here. If you don't understand what's going to happen today, I'm going to speak now for a little while. I don't know what these other chairs are for. I started to believe maybe other candidates are going to show up. We're going to have a real walkabout here. But I'm going to speak, and then I hope almost all the time we've had a few minutes for questions. RN's our timekeeper. She's going to keep us on time so you get out here on time. And so she's going to tell me when to stop.
10 o'clock.
She does that well.
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock is what she's saying. And then I'm going to walk out the door, and you're going to be with her, and you'll be able to discuss openly whatever you might want to discuss. Welcome. On May 12th, 2007, gathered at your cathedral, St. Mark's in Seattle, the delegates of this diocese elected me your 8th bishop. About a month earlier, 4 other candidates and myself roamed the face of this diocese, talking a lot and listening some. This is what had become known in the church as a walkabout. 12 years ago, I never heard a word about it being called that, and yet on this end of that 12 years, you will now see us as a church moving away from that term and across the church, because of course a walkabout is a real spiritual thing. So like many things we've taken in the church, we've appropriated that name from something that's a very spiritual matter in many places. So we're not calling it walkabouts anymore, but that's what it was called then. And so we riffed off that a little bit with WalkAgain. That's where that came from. And this one small way shows that the church learns and changes and grows, and that's happened for all of us too in 12 years. It's just as true for me as well. In that 1 week time of sharing back then, I, in the midst of all the others, talked of what I might do or not do were I to become your bishop. And during that walkabout, I made a pledge that I would not stay more than 10 to 12 years. Now, all during those 10, 12 years, people would come up and say things like, "Didn't you say 3 years?" I thought you said 5 years. You know? These were hopeful people, hoping that my time had come to an end. To me at that time in my life, both chronologically and vocationally, 10 to 12 years seemed like plenty long enough. And quite frankly, standing in those places back then, I was thinking, if I could survive that long, it would be a miracle. In fact, many of us on that first walkabout kind of joked during that week that maybe the way this works is whoever is left standing after this week gets to be the bishop. And I also truly believe that anyone that looked at me, 43 years of age at that point, the youngest bishop in the Episcopal Church at that time, if elected, I thought you all might be thinking, if we elect this guy, we could be stuck with him for 30 years. For all those reasons, I thought the pledge was a good thing, and it still might be, which is what this discernment in this year and in this day is part of and is all about. The reality of it is this for me. It's flown by. And what I thought I might feel and we might feel by this point is just totally different than the reality of it then. Nobody knows about this office until they're in it. They don't teach this in seminary. People that aspire to it are considered strange and odd and maybe even arrogant. So we just don't do it as a church. We don't prepare people for it until you're in it. So I brought all of this up about a year and a half ago with our governing bodies. And what I did, it was a strange moment. The whole notion seemed to be misplaced, out of order, akin to stopping while in the middle of something. And I think we all felt it. I announced at a governing bodies retreat that it was time. I needed to phase out if I was going to keep that pledge. And they all just stared back at me for the longest time. And they more or less said, we just feel like we just got started, which I felt some of that too, but I had made the pledge, and I think vows are important. Pledges and promises are important. And so I didn't think we could just ignore it or go past it. And maybe we could talk about it in other ways, and that's why we came up with what we're doing now. So this is the year of listening that we've kind of come to. And now with all of you, this second of 5 of these sessions, we're going to engage that time and do discernment together. Ariane's going to walk through more details of the year a bit later, so I'll leave that to her. All of that to say, this is about us discerning together. That's the way I see it. It's been suggested already by a few, because nothing in the church escapes criticism, that we're just going through all of this, as this person said, so, quote, Greg can get some good strokes. Well, I can assure you I've gotten less than good strokes also, but I just want to say I hope not, that that's not what this is about. And I believe if we do this process right, it will not be about that. And I don't feel it's about that. And as you might expect, opening yourself up to this also brings on some of the criticisms as well, and it certainly has. I believe some diocesan bishops have avoided such a process for just this reason. And when I tell them about it, they often cock their head and look at me and say, what are you thinking? But I think that that's where this place is special. We've been able to do some things that no one else would try. And literally, we have not been able to find any similar process that anybody has ever tried. I have actually told some of you this in other talks like this, that I actually believe our search process in the Episcopal Church and in many of the Protestant churches is kind of like cheating on your wife. You know, we sneak around and find the next place that we're going to go. Then we come home and tell you about it, and we're out of there in about 6 weeks. And it seems like as Christians, we ought to be able to do that better than that. And so this is an attempt at that, to see how that might work. If we do this well, and it works as we intend and dream, it will be about how we have lived into our collective call so far to build up the base camp that is our church, and thereby strengthening us all to be better prepared, able, and willing to go into the world and share the good news of Jesus Christ. And even more, to help us answer the questions, can that and should that continue with us working together? On that day in May in 2007, the things rolling around in my head about what it was to be a bishop could not have been much farther away from the reality reality of actually being one. And that's a more apparent now more than ever. Whether it's believed or not, for me, this is real discernment. I have no preordained ideas of what the end will be. I'm truly listening, wondering, both for what will be the best for me and my family, and also what will be best for you and our work together. And I hope you will engage it the same way. 12 years ago, not knowing much about this diocese, I relied heavily on the profile that was developed by this diocese in a process somewhat similar to what we're doing now. In a way, we're kind of developing a profile with the bishop in place. That's the oddity of this. And as I read that profile back then, 3 specific things jumped out at me. And out of that came the 3 focus areas I shared as I wondered about the diocese, sharing with you in that first walkabout. Concentration on people under the age of 35, congregational development, and stewardship of all of our resources. For me, that's what I took from the profile as outward wishes of you, the people here. Many in this diocese resonated with those 3 things. Now, not so specific, and clergy know this, and some of the laity in the room too, especially this crowd, knows that there's a profile where all the words and the ideas are stated, and then there's the in between the lines that's not stated, out of the conversations, that you pick up only after you're there. And there were some of those there too, that only you find out after you arrive. What I picked up on was a loss of trust between the office of bishop and the people, and some despair of response and connection, and even a lot of anxiety about money and finances. That was in there. It was even more in the people when I arrived. So as I walked in, I put forward those 3 outward things as what we would work on, but always in my mind and working on those was this deep need to build trust and to also create better response and connection to those who reached out to the office of bishop. And I knew, being a leader and an administrator before, at least my style was that I was going to have to be out there, out of my office, far more than in it, that we were going to have to be clear, transparent, and truthful with one another, even when that was blunt and sometimes hard to hear. And we would very much have to honor our pledges and promises, cop to our failures when we make them, and build the avenues of communication so we could do that. With all of that in mind, I also picked up on a little bit of what I have called rudderlessness, meandering, lack of direction. And so in my leadership repertoire, my choice was to come in a bit more heavy-handed than I think a bishop in the best scenario would operate, to strongly take the reins. To me, if we were going to succeed in those things, it was going to take some strong leadership, some unrelenting focus and time, and I had no idea how much at that point. It's taken much to get there. Who knows if we're really there? And of course, that perception is always in the minds of the beholder, so this is only my opinion at this point. But we've come a long way in all of those. What has happened in that 12 years is almost a 0% non-payment on assessments. It was over 13% when I arrived. And we've lowered assessments. They were 20% when I arrived, and they're now 14.5%, with a constant attempt to lower it even more so we can leave more at the local level. Our belief has been that one way to give back, to essentially grant to every congregation, is to ask for less in the first place. It's only one sign of trust and connection, but it's a pretty significant one. Because again, if you look across the Episcopal Church, they are astounded by the fact that we have almost 0% non-payment. That doesn't happen in very many places. I also think we've grown to the point where I don't have to take the reins so heavily, and haven't for some time, and my hope has been, and I've said this if you've been at conventions, to give the diocese back to you, to let go a little bit, especially the parts I may have taken a heavy hand with. What I was personally thinking is, if all of this goes well and we can do that, the point would be in 10 to 12 years to take my hands off the reins, to ease up a bit, and to begin handing the diocese back to the people. or at the very least, to ease up and find a more balanced reality. I think our new vision was the first step, the turn we made in trying to live into that. In union, together, we bear witness to the Jesus movement, to God's inclusive love, by being locally centered network communities who form Christian leaders for sacrament and service. So, several things come from that. What I call directionality, which was stopping triangulation, figuring out who needs to be in conversations and who doesn't. Some of that started with the 10 rules for respect, which have always been part of my letters of agreement. And I've really been amazed how that took off in this. Oh yeah, there they are right there. I see these everywhere. They're framed on walls. It, I think, proves the hunger for that kind of communication, and especially in this world we're living in now, even more important. The second is authenticity, telling the truth even when it hurts and even when it's our fault, and trying to become a people where that is not only something we see happen, but it's expected and we can honor it. Now the next part, I'm less sure how much to do. I'm always worried about it in this. This is the one part of the process where we've struggled, because the whole idea of this is for me not to lead you into what you think we ought to do in the next 5 to 7 to 10 years, but to let you figure that out. But it's also important in this process for you to hear what I think we ought to do in those times. So that's what I'm going to do a little bit of now. When I think about where we are now and taking into consideration our new vision, I see these things as our focus for the next 5 to 7 years. First, moving from maintaining to growing. And I really believe, and have always believed, that every congregation can grow. The College for Congregational Development, that one focus area that we had, was designed to give the tools for congregations to do that. And CCD is wildly successful in the church. Sometimes we can sit here and not realize that, but 27 other dioceses are either doing it in totality or sending people to this diocese to take it. So what's happened so far? In this area, I think when people ask about growth, I would say in the 10 to 12 years I've been here, we've stopped the bleeding. We're not declining, but we're still not growing. I think a major sign for me was the Bishop's Leadership Conference. If you all came to that, the one thing that I learned from that, or felt from that, was that if we had tried that conference the first year I was here, I think it would have been a dismal failure. A dismal failure. I don't think anybody would have shown up. I think we would have wasted our money. And yet, 12 years in, we sold it out. We had to tell some people they couldn't come. And we have the second one scheduled, because people walking out the door said, when are we going to do this again? We've got to do it again. That's a hungry people who believe that we can grow. That's what I got from that. And I think now we can actually focus on evangelism, truly growing the church. I think some of our questions when I walked in the door were, if we invite people, what are we inviting them to? We still have to answer that question. But I think we're better equipped now to answer that question and to begin to invite people into our midst. The second is living into and owning our innovation and sharing it beyond ourselves. I think there's a humbleness about our diocese in a way, and I certainly try to be that way, but I want to tell you, Olympia is looked at by the Episcopal Church with much admiration and really astounding awe at times about what can happen here. And that's because of you. That's because of our work together. And I think in the next phase, we've got to own that and even be more open about giving it away to the church. Still learning ourselves, but also being willing to give it away to the church. The College for Congregational Development, of course, is one of those ways. We've already done that. Nets for Life, some of you remember that. Nets for Life started here. The Genesis Covenant started here, and was both of those adopted entirely by the Episcopal Church after that. Many of the pastoral letters that come out of this diocese are used across the church. Our anti-racism moves into intercultural competency led the church, the Episcopal Church, to adopt that process as well. And with deacons, the order of deacons, we're considered a leader as well. Third, being a prophetic voice to Western Washington, to the Episcopal Church, and to our country and the world. We have a lot of things to show for that. One of the ones that I was with this week is Chaplains on the Harbor in Westport. When Sarah came to me with that dream, I will admit to you, I said, this isn't going to last long. And she's gone from literally zero budget, walking around the streets on a shoestring, to a budget that's almost $300,000 a year. And I was at a fundraiser for that this past week, and you know, it looks like no end. She's actually employing people that used to live on the streets. And that's all because of you, because the generosity for that money has come from you. It's come from you from donations, but we also calculated since its inception, the diocese has granted that ministry $330,000 to make sure it could survive and move and grow. And all of that came from you. That's your assessment dollars at work. And I think it's a good example to the greater church. Becoming sustainable, the courage to be on the front lines of issues. We're definitely on the front lines of immigration and refugee resettlement. And we've been on the front lines actually long before me, for 30 plus years, with our refugee resettlement office in Seattle, which really is looked at as one of the strongest ones in the Episcopal Church and in the country. If you haven't been paying attention, many of them have shut down since this administration has started its work. And because we have a great executive director and lots of focus on ours in Seattle, it's strong and doing well. So, many of those things for us to claim our prophetic voice in the church. And just a few other things that I think we should consider. Longevity, and a bishop can cut both ways. And I know that. The House of Bishops is kind of like the Senate. If you've been there longer, you get better chairs and stuff like that. So in some ways, we do benefit from that. I'm now the president of the Province 8 House of Bishops. So I'm on the council advice for the presiding bishop. I'm on the board of the Church Pension Fund, on the Association of Episcopal Deacons, the bishop member for that. So becoming a senior bishop in the House of Bishops can be good for us, and I would also say takes me away. So, you know, the joke that Bishop Bain used to tell is, I'm the bishop from Olympia, not the bishop of Olympia, because he was on somewhere else. And I think about that often. But my number in the succession, in the American succession, is 1021. And I was in Arizona last week, where I was the bishop who gave the number to the new bishop of Arizona, Jennifer Redall, and her number is 1113. So almost 100 bishops have turned over since I became a bishop in 2007. That is a huge shift in the house. And I'm shocked that at 12 years in, and with many people leaving, I'm about to be one of the senior bishops in the House of Bishops. I think that's a great thing. But it cuts both ways, and I just want to honor that. In the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the change in this diocese, in our church, and in me, and I want to say a bit more about that. Of course, I had no idea what this role would be like. No one does. And I had no idea how I or we might feel 10 years in. All of that's true. But I want to say, regardless of all of that, is that I have changed and I have learned. While my accent has not changed quite enough yet, and it tends to still give me away as an outsider, I don't feel like one. I feel attached to this geography and to the people and to all of you. Wherever I go, when I land at SeaTac, I know I'm home. And at the Bishop's Leadership Conference, one of the great things is we were standing down with the staff and they said, we don't know who's here. As I looked out on that theater. And I could go through it and say, well, I'll tell you who's here. 10 years ago, I couldn't have told you anything about that. But I knew everybody that was here. They're from here, they're from here, they're here, they're here. There's some good in that too, certainly for me. No matter where I go after this does all end, I will always carry the Pacific Northwest with me. I've changed also as a person, as a bishop, and I need to tell you that is mostly due to the gracious way you allowed me to become part of this diocese and this place. It is a dance, and I think we've done it pretty well. While I hope I've helped you learn, I want to assure you and thank you for the ways you've taught me, nurtured me, changed me. I'm not the same person who had hands laid on his head in Meidenbauer Center about 12 years ago. I'm grateful for that difference, whether this continue or not. So I want to thank you. If it all ended tomorrow, it would end as one of the greatest honors, privileges, and blessings to be in this place doing this thing amongst all of you. So, it's time for me to end. Our Ann's glad about that. And I want to say this. Just before I was consecrated a decade ago, the new presiding bishop at the time, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, sent me a framed quote by Dom Helder Camara, the Brazilian bishop who had a special dispensation from Rome to become a priest at age 21 and then became a bishop in his 40s and was a bishop until he died at 90 years old. So he was a bishop for over 50 years. He knew what it was to be one. He also is attributed with the famous quote, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." But this is the quote that was framed and is in my office where I can see it when I walk in and when I walk out. If you're ever in my office, you'll see it too. This is the quote. "The bishop belongs to all. Let no one be scandalized if I frequent those who are considered unworthy or sinful, who is not a sinner. Let no one be alarmed if I am seen with compromised and dangerous people on the left or the right. Let no one bind me to a group. My door, my heart must be open to everyone, absolutely everyone." I pray daily to be able to live in just that way. So, I thank you for being here today, for all the things that you do for this diocese and for this church, for being leaders and witnesses you are for our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you.
We do have a couple minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions for the bishop, particularly about what he just shared with us? Oh, here, I'll go close first.
I'm kind of new to the Episcopal Church, so I'm not sure how it works, but if you leave, what would happen then?
Well, that's a good
That's
question.
a great question, actually.
Yeah. If I leave, everything will fall apart. No, absolutely, nothing will fall apart. The way it works is that you would, if this goes like we plan, in December I'll come back from sabbatical and make a decision about what will happen. If I decided to resign, I would announce that resignation, and then we'd begin a search process. And the intent would be for me to stay in place until a bishop was here, but realizing that I am not vested in the pension fund yet, and that I need a job, that could end quicker because I'd have to go find something and leave. And I will tell you, this is a good question because the presiding bishop has already asked me to look at 2 other places. About 6 months ago, he asked me to literally leave here and go to another diocese that's in trouble, and to take that diocese and to be there for about 5 years, which would have, added to the time. Those kind of things really were helpful in my discernment because I didn't want to do it. I could do it. It would have been an interesting thing to do, actually, in this place. But I was certain I didn't want to do it right now. If that happens, that's how it will happen. And typically, the searches are taking about 18 months to 2 years. And some of them aren't going real well. So I think it's another thing to kind of think about. Some of the searches have fallen apart and have been stopped. And the slates are hard to fill. And I will say, on a sad note, in a way, there's kind of a McCarthyism going on in the church, where several of these lists at the last minute, somebody brings up something about one of the people. And this happened in Maine. It's happened in many of the elections. Usually the people are exonerated, but when you bring something up nasty about them 3 days before the election, it changes it. So it's an interesting time for elections in the church too. So that's what would happen.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Greg. Don't leave.
I think we got time for one more. So I saw someone over here. Oh, okay. So that was what would you do if you weren't?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
Could you
In the
repeat
walkabout,
question?
she asked what would I do if I wasn't here. Well, I might, in the walkabout I said I might run a bar in Key West. I actually have a name, trying to get a patent on a name called The Confessional. But that'll come later. I promise I won't do it while I'm here. It's a good question. I mean, I could do what I just described, where there is a need for provisional bishops, people that go and are basically interims in a place until they can do a search. So that could be one thing. I could actually go back to the parish and be a rector again. Or I might just, I don't know. There's lots of things I could do. I think going back to the parish would be fun. And I also believe I probably lost my chops for that. Because I tell clergy this all the time, their job's very different from my job. And I've been out of that job for 12 years, so I'd have to relearn it. But I could do it if I needed to do it. I will tell you that on August 1st, 2026, I will be fully vested in the church pension fund. And wherever I am, it will be coming to an end. I do know how to retire, I think, and I will.
Okay. So maybe one more. Somebody for. Okay, good. We had a hand. Shoot right up.
I'm so a little unclear. Do you want us to give you our vision for the next 10 years and you buy
Yes.
into it?
Basically, she's going to walk you.
What a great segue.
Yeah, I know.
It's like you primed us for this whole agenda.
I'll give you my take. And
Why don't you do that?
I mean, the answer is yes. And you're also discerning if your vision is very different than the one I'm talking about. The question still is it us together that does it, or is it someone else? So those are the things we're asking you. Yeah.
All right. So that actually is a natural step into the next thing we're going to do. And so for the next bit, until about 10:30, I'm going to be talking to you about what we're doing today, why we're here today, and then after a quick break, you're going to have a chance to actually give us some of that information about where we're heading. and what you think about our future and vision together. And he's going to go with
I'm leaving. Bye.
Thank you, Greg.